Good afternoon. It's March 21st, 2022 at 3:44 my time. And boy, it's kind of amazing when you consider the ongoing confirmation hearings that are about to begin, really, in the Supreme Court nomination from the Biden administration of Ketanji Jackson Brown, who is an African American woman. And I don't know much of her history so far, but I wanted to bring this attention to all of our African American followers and friends that are tapping into some of the things that we put out there to make you aware of the horrendous and the horrific targeting and predation and the massive calamity that befell African Americans as a result of the 2008 Great Financial Crisis. Numbers put the evaporation of African American household wealth at 60%. I mean, that's staggering. And when you consider what took place in the African American community, it wasn't just to folks that might have been considered recipients of what we might call the Community Reinvestment Act. There were professionals, many professionals, doctors, and government contractors, and military personnel, and all of those types of people that have found their slice of the American dream that were literally targeted. We're talking people that could be PhDs, doctors, any sort of professional at the highest levels were literally targeted by the financial system to be swept into predatory loans. And there was a methodology that basically led to what we call high yield spread premium. I really would love to connect with all of you because it just tears apart of my soul and the soul of the fabric of the United States to know that after all of the horrific sort of history that African Americans have endured in this country, from being slaves for hundreds of years and everything that led to, and then of course the Civil War, and of course Jim Crow after the fact, and the horrific realities of Jim Crow that led to the Great Migration. That's where we picked up our story in the con of one Addie Polk. She and her husband, Robert Polk, had migrated during the Great Migration in the early 1919s and right before the First World War to the industrial Midwest of the United States, which had been at that time starting to increase its manufacturing base. And as we got into in between and towards World War II, they began to hire both women and African Americans to replace white working men that went overseas to fight the war. And that gave the opportunity to somebody like Addie Polk, through her husband Robert Polk, who had two jobs in Akron rubber factories, to be able to get their slice of the American dream, which was an absolute huge achievement by African Americans, as you might well imagine. So fast forward many decades, and we had in the 60s and the 70s, we had a methodology by banks. Actually, it probably permeated in the 50s first, but it was called redlining. And the redlining was to prevent African American communities from being part of the financial system, from getting loans and building a middle class. They were subjugated to a systemic racism. And there was great gains made by the civil rights movement that changed many of those laws, that then created situations that provided the opportunity for Addie and Robert and the millions like them to get their piece of American home ownership. And then as we moved forward into about the late 90s and the early 2000s, a lot of those folks had passed away. They handed off their home, to their children, that they bequeathed to them, obviously. And a lot of those children did not have a lot of knowledge as it related to real estate as an asset, and all of the different variables that kind of come with that sort of responsibility. It only comes from, obviously, if you're taught all of the different variables of how home ownership can work for you, even with as many incentives that may have happened. And so one of the things that took place during the 70s, what am I talking about? Fast forward to the 80s and the 90s, but particularly in the 90s, we had what was known as the Community Reinvestment Act. And so that was actually forcing banks who had banking locations in specific areas in minority neighborhoods that they had to loan in a 50 square mile radius of that particular banking institution. And so when we had the 2008 great financial crisis, one of the underlying myths, and it was again part and parcel of the things that I've been informing you guys about for some time, which is blaming the victim. So a lot of the media and people, particularly that kind of leaned right and that led into the Tea Party, and then ultimately that led into MAGA, a lot of those folks were blaming the government for loaning to poor people. Now, understand that subprime is a misnomer. So a lot of people thought that the subprime crisis is what devastated the housing market. It wasn't. It was just a pipeline of what we call liar's loans through deceptive acts and practices. That's different than subprime. Subprime is a methodology by which people who might have had something tarnished on their credit, that are rebuilding their credit, would have to pay higher interest rates to get an opportunity to get loans to be able to buy a house. Now, in some cases, for example, in those particular, I don't know, I guess the arena of subprime, you might have people that are within the boundaries of these community reinvestment acts that might have jobs, working in whatever they did in those particular communities, be it in restaurants or, in a bar or fast food or whatever the case may be. They might not have been high income borrowers, but they were borrowers with jobs so that they could afford real estate that was priced in those neighborhoods that would be concurrent to what the earning potential was in those areas. And so there were many, many people that got loans, under CRA, but that actually had jobs. That's different than liar's loans. People who didn't have income and didn't have assets and didn't have any reason to be able to get into a loan. That's different than subprime. So fast forward to now, with the Supreme Court Justice Ketanji Jackson Brown being considered in the wake of a lot of things that have taken place in the last really 13 years, but really coming to a head this past summer. So it was incumbent upon then Federal Reserve Chairman Alan Greenspan to regulate the housing market, because the Federal Reserve is what pumps liquidity into all of the different financial structure to create the sort of, lending capacity to be able to create, development and lending on homes and so on and so forth. And all of this stuff constituted what became the mortgage-backed securities. And so there was a feeding frenzy, there was new loans, and it created an underbelly of fraud. So for example, we have this insane revelation of what straw buying is. This is in the con, and it involves Addie Polk, and it involved many, many, many people in the African-American community specifically, and also the Latino community. And what would happen is banks literally would send members into African-American churches, meet with some of the spiritual leaders, create incentive programs to where they could provide loans to members of their congregation who fit certain criteria, particularly like Addie Polk, who had their own assets, who owned their own home, because they were trying to get them to refinance based on their equity to be able to get loans, because presumably, as I've already framed for you guys in several of these, they would actually increase the appraisal value of those houses. So people, for example, who might be elderly, who lived on fixed income, like Addie Polk in our show, who incidentally, LeBron James grew up 400 feet from the church that Addie Polk attended for 4 decades. And if anybody wants to help me, please get this message to LeBron James, because he really needs to know it, considering he came from this area. Addie Polk, attended the Antioch Baptist Church for 4 decades, and she was a woman of dignity and a woman of integrity. And by all accounts, she really, really managed her business close to the vest. And so she would never get out of her lane, so to speak, to take on something that she couldn't contend with. Now, that's a lot of assumption on my part based on a lot of anecdotal evidence, and also people that I've interviewed that had said as much. But that doesn't negate the fact that straw buying was happening in her church and in the community. And what straw buying is when churches were approached by lending institutions, most notably Wells Fargo, particularly in the Baltimore, Washington, D.C. metro area, and other major African-American communities around the country. They were targeted in these predatory loans, and that was at the actual bank level. Now, because of these types of things that were going on, people learned that they could get loans if they worked with somebody within the bank and they created documentation fabrication based on someone's equity. They could literally take that person's information and then, put it to the bank, forge a signature, and act as an intermediary to basically steal the equity in their home, and then refinance and leave those people on the hook to pay for a loan that they didn't take out in their own name. Meanwhile, they were long gone with the money from the refinance. It's absolutely sickening that it was literally connected to the church, and there were criminals literally operating within the churches that were giving kickbacks to the church that either knew or didn't know. But that actually brings out, something that I actually want to address, because, I hear Dr. Cornel West and the Reverend Barber talk about systemic economic racism in pretty much everything they do. But they don't talk about this. And I don't know if it's something they're not aware of, or maybe it's uncomfortable, because it would be uncomfortable for me to think that someone in my congregation, particularly that was a senior member of the congregation, might have been working with somebody to set other people up that could actually steal their homes and destroy their lives. That's something that would be such a remarkable stain. The only thing that could potentially come close to something like that is, of course, like a church where you, respect the priest, and he's there for, everything that happens in your life, from marriage to all of the other, scenarios that take place in your religion, and then you find out that priest has been raping children in the congregation. That happened, of course, and we know that happened. It's probably still happening to this day. But I mean, it's a very, 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 very uncomfortable and a very awkward and just a really horrifying scenario, quite frankly. I can't think of anything worse than preying on the innocent in a place that they have to pour their spiritual self into, and everything that constitutes only to be stolen from, raped, pillaged, whatever you want to call it, destroyed. It's just, there is no bigger mark of the devil than that, just as a metaphor. But it's insane what people are capable of. Okay, so 60% of the African American household wealth evaporated in 2008 as a result of this predation. And I've got information that's even more than that. I know exactly how brokers targeted the elderly by actually going inside the county records, identifying people who had equity in their houses, realizing how some of these people were going to get hit with fines because they had to get their roof fixed or their sidewalks fixed because they had these laws based on blight in the neighborhoods. And so they would show up with these loans like manna from heaven. They targeted these people to get them in because the brokers were given, huge bonuses. They get paid right away when the loans kick in. And they also had high yield spread premium if they sold the people a higher interest rate through, deceptive acts and practices. So all of that type of stuff was going on, which is incredibly important, because the first and only African American president in U.S. history comes into office. He's, presumably going to clean up this madness, but he doesn't. Barack Obama came out of Harvard. So what's the first thing he does? He puts all of the big guns from the Ivy League who created this madness back into positions of power, even though he sold the country that it was change we can believe in. And they just cleaned up the madness, and nobody else understood what actually happened. And of course, he had then Attorney General Eric Holder, who, of course, I'm not sure. I think he was the first African-American Attorney General in the United States. Nevertheless, he came out of Covington and Burling, which was literally the most connected Wall Street law firm. And they're the ones that actually created their part of the legal part of the structure of what we call MERGE, the Mortgage Electronic Registration System, that buried millions and millions of people, that led to the national mortgage settlement in 2012, which led to $25 billion going back to the states, of which, of course, Eric Holder, drew out, didn't do any criminal investigation into the criminal CEOs on Wall Street who had literally done targeted predation. So it's insane that we have two African Americans who came in after this incredible history of African American struggle in the United States, not to mention, of course, the modern history going back to the race riots of the 60s all the way through Black Lives Matter. But just consider how horrific this reality is, because in the end, the African Americans were targeted in all the ways that I talked about, but just think about how insane this is, right? And so when the world blew up, they started basically bulldozing foreclosures on these people en masse with operations that didn't have the right to foreclose. They didn't have the paperwork. It became such a ginormous mess because of all of the problems that went into everything that I've been describing to you, that the foreclosing parties have to follow specific foreclosing procedure because they're presumably owed the debt. but it created, just like straw buying on the way up with these hyenas that were stealing equity from people's houses, it did the same thing with the destruction on the way down, because people were getting illegally foreclosed on because the judges weren't taking into account discovery, because there was such a monumental tidal wave of these things that they couldn't keep it blocked in the court if they actually looked into what actually was going on and then upheld the law. And so many millions of innocent people got, and continue to this day, to be purged in the courts, taking the only asset that they have and the only stability and, the only way they could possibly live, and then throw them out on the streets that led to, in the case of Addie Polk, her committing suicide. It's a horrific, horrific story. And again, it didn't just happen. There were actual, and I have the evidence of it, the banks, the too big to fail banks, one of which, Wells Fargo, I have targeted evidence of how, I have evidence of how they targeted. It was a plan. It was that they taught to all of their mortgage brokers on how to, sucker anyone who was African American into these loans. I mean, it's the betrayal of what this is all about is so remarkable. It hurts me to even talk about it. Okay, so let's try to reset what we're talking about here. Dr. Cornel West and Reverend Barber and Nina Turner, for example, like Bernie Sanders and like, quite frankly, Elizabeth Warren and many other politicians or well-known people, they talk about systemic predation. I've seen, for example, Cornel West. I included a clip of him in one of our promos for the con, where he says that the banks got away with crimes, but he never talks about the crimes and how they did it, because I don't think he knows it. Cornel West needs to understand what happened, so please send this to Cornel West. Send it to LeBron James. Send it to Reverend Barber. I've been trying to get a hold of Reverend Barber ever since I found out about the Poor People's Campaign, because I've seen him talk about systemic racism in the economic engine of the United States, but he doesn't talk about this stuff. Okay, and I've got the evidence. So let's take it back to Ketanji Jackson Brown, who's running for the Supreme Court. Now, for those of you who might be saying, well, Patrick, so many other people like you got caught up in this madness, and so it wasn't just about African Americans. Well, no, of course it wasn't just about African Americans. What they did was they connected it to the white working class before they went to young professionals such as myself at the time, who didn't have any idea what was going on, and I got into a house because I had, I was making the income that they said I could afford, and, then all of a sudden the economy wiped out and my income left, and then I got caught holding the bag, and that's when I found out through a modification I was getting jacked, and that's what led me on this journey to bring these truths to you that nobody else has or will. And so, for example, they got the white working class. They created a pipeline to pensions. All of these bad loans that they put through the system, that they lied every step of the way, that Warren Buffett's Moody's gave AAA to, because that's the only way you could get it to pensions. So they put it into the white, working class, the guys that, the steel workers, the iron workers, the guys you've seen with the trucks and the American flags who, are salt of the earth. And I've met these guys, and they're beautiful human beings, man. And they got freaking burned. They got burned big time. And then ultimately, there's been some stuff that took place after, quite frankly, in the CARES Act, where finally some of these retirees were able to get some remedy. But that was, years and years later, after they had to live on like 50% of their pension. So that's what ultimately makes up a large part of what, the MAGA frustration is, right? Those who went to Trump because Obama failed us. So when we look to Ketanji Jackson Brown, as she's coming in, first, I want you all to be aware of the horrific scenario that took place to befell Addie Polk. But this is what I really need you to be aware of, okay? On top of all of that. So I'll start with this path first. Donald Trump was up to his ears in debt where he couldn't get out of it, like a lot of other developers back in the 2010 to 2012 era. And he was in deep, deep shit. And he was trying to get out of loans that he owed Deutsche Bank. And he ended up setting up a lawsuit like he does in pretty much everything else he does. And he ended up suing Deutsche Bank for being a victim of predatory lending. Okay? And that enabled to get him out of his loans for a short time until he made some sort of other arrangements. But this, meanwhile, while Trump was involved, not just with Trump University, which led to a $25 million lawsuit that he admitted to predatory lending, but he also had Trump University or Trump mortgages. So Trump mortgages, there's no way in hell, and I'm just saying this as speculation because I have never investigated Trump University. I've only investigated all of the other players, such as AmeriQuest and Countrywide and Nation Star and many, many others, where they were involved with what they called the fix-it shops, where they were using documentation fraud to be able to create and bolster up these loans so that people could either get approved, so that the salesman could get, the account executive, the broker could get a fee, or you had straw buyers stealing those fucking fees. Okay, so those things were happening in the mud, in the level at the very origination of which, of course, if Trump's involved with that stuff, his company's doing the same thing. Would you put it past Trump, given everything you know? Well, let me tell you something. I'll get to that in a second. But let's just put it this way. If Trump got wind of this, and you understand what happened with the big lie, and what's been revealed in the last, several months, is that there was documentation fabrication for election certifications in 6 states that were run through from Giuliani in a very orchestrated fashion. And it just always occurred to me, is it possible that Trump and his team of people that wanted to try to figure out a way to get the election or steal the election back would actually come up with documentation fabrication to do so? And if so, where did it come from? Well, it came from this. And again, I remind you, Donald Trump sued Deutsche Bank for being a victim of predatory lending when he was involved with predatory lending. And I wish so badly all of you folks that support Trump, realize that he was involved with doing the things that buried people, like I'm telling you, were salt of the earth iron workers and steel workers from the Midwest that got burned by Wall Street. You remember when Trump said he was going to drain the swamp? The first thing he did was he put all of the major guys from Goldman in, who destroyed everybody, into his cabinet. I'm sorry, what don't you get? Is it that complicated? But what does this have to do with Ketanji Jackson Brown in the nomination for the Supreme Court? Everything. Because then Federal Reserve Chairman Alan Greenspan was mandated by Congress to regulate the housing markets because of what's known as HOEPA, Homeowner Equity Protection Act. That was in the purview of the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve offers low interest rates or zero interest rates to stimulate building. And then what Greenspan did was, he was notified by many people that I have in the con that I've dealt with, that I've gotten incredible information from, that proves all of the stuff that I'm talking about, documentation evidence, documentary evidence, and not to mention I've got them on camera. But these folks went through a gentleman by the name of Ned Gramlich, who was the chair of the Philadelphia Fed, and he notified Greenspan of all of the findings that everybody was doing this, investigation, literally from, I think, somewhere around 2004 all the way to the collapse, right? So Greenspan walks, and I think, what was it, 2006, 2007, right before he hands it off to Bernanke. But the bottom line, it was incumbent upon Greenspan to end this thing, and he didn't. And by the way, Greenspan came out of Lincoln Continental, where his boss at Lincoln Continental back in the S&L crisis was a guy by the name of Charles Keating, who was the CEO of the biggest bankruptcy in American history before we got to the Lehman collapse in 2008. And that's where, and he got arrested for fraud, by the way, by my mentor, Bill Black, in the S&L crisis. And that's where Alan Greenspan came out of. So they put the guy who was, not going to regulate, because they knew that he wasn't going to stop what ultimately became the 2008 Great Financial Crisis, and all of the stuff that I've told you about policy and all of the changes that took place during the Clinton administration, helped make that all happen. And of course, Greenspan was Federal Reserve at that time, chairman at that time. So he's there to let it all happen. And then in the end, when it collapses on everybody's head, you got two mega freaking disasters that shape up. The first is you had Alan Greenspan walk, where Bernanke comes in, and then the collapse happens, and they turn on what they call the bazooka. The entire country thought that we got, initially we were sold that it was going to be a $700 billion emergency stimulus program called TARP that came out of Congress. It wasn't. It was $29 trillion, and that was enabled by the Federal Reserve. $29 trillion for the people who destroyed the likes of Addie Polk and black people all over the country. And the guys that did it got $29 trillion. Okay? So that's one part of like the Eureka nightmare of all time. And if that wasn't enough, what did President Barack Obama do? Mr. Change We Can Believe In, the first African-American president who, Barry is as cool and as gifted as it gets. And obviously he's a constitutional law expert from Harvard. Just so you know, he was also, I guess an activist on the streets of Chicago, helping to organize. He was an organizer, okay? But he was also involved as a junior senator, and I've got this on camera too, by the way. He was a junior senator in Illinois where he wrote the anti-predatory legislation with someone who I know, who appears in the con, Ira Reingold, who is out of a big think tank consumer protection agency in Washington, D.C., and they co-wrote the bill that turned out to be the precursor to some stuff that happened in Georgia later, but that means that Obama understood predatory lending. So what happens when Obama gets in to clean up the mess? Well, eventually he appears on 60 Minutes, where he tells the world that while what Wall Street did was unethical, and it might have even been, I think he used some word like horrific, it wasn't illegal. Okay, I hope we can hit the rewind again, and I'm reminding you that I'm talking about the nomination of Ketanji Jackson Brown for the Supreme Court, okay? So all of this takes shape. Literally, you've got the chairman of the Federal Reserve who turns his back to being notified of all of the stuff that would eventually destroy the African American, part of the American dream with home ownership. Okay, just destroyed it. But then they allowed trillions of dollars who came after Bernanke into the guy's hands that Obama and Holder never held to account. The Jamie Dimons of the world, who Jon Stewart asked, these ridiculous questions, and Jon Stewart has no idea who Jamie Dimon is. Same with, God, I could go through the whole litany of the CEOs of that time from Bank of America and Goldman Sachs and, Morgan Stanley and all the rest that were involved with this, right? They all walked. They ultimately all paid $250 billion in fines, that they whitewashed this thing. Nobody was the wiser, and nobody had any, they had what they called statements of facts that were no statement of facts, and then they connected the fines to the shareholders. Okay, and the banks got $29 trillion. Or the Federal Reserve, they got like, I guess the big ones got somewhere in the $6 to $7 trillion scenario where all the other financial system got the rest. But I mean, we're talking trillions of dollars to bail out their lunatic madness that destroyed the most vulnerable amongst us. And so that takes us again to my final point, and I brought her name up like 4 times during this conversation. The Supreme Court Justice nominee, Ketanji Jackson Brown. And, last summer, and it summarizes the whole thing, the Supreme Court held, they heard a case of the Arkansas Teachers Union, pension union, as well as the Pipe Fitters and Plumbers of America Union, that had a co-jointed lawsuit against Goldman Sachs for the shorts that destroyed their pensions. Again, like I said, the white working class. Obviously, there's African Americans that are plumbers and teachers and that sort of thing, but I'd say predominantly white, okay? And what did SCOTUS do? They just said there wasn't an expectation that Goldman would have known what was going on. And so therefore, they couldn't be on the hook for the fallout, for the loss in revenue to these because based on these shorts. That's just, a mark of what happens in the market. That's the risk, basically. And that's not through the legalese, but trust me, there's a lot of legas in there. But you know what else I have? I have the information that Goldman Sachs handpicked with John Paulson the worst of the worst loans that they threw in these CDOs and these tranches that they used then to short the world. And to put it in perspective, I just heard this today, as a matter of fact. So Michael Burry was the guy that Christian Bale played in the Big Short, And if you've seen the movie, it's incredible. If you haven't seen the movie, I highly encourage you to, but I need you to understand that Michael Burry, I think he made out with $100 million on The Big Short himself, and he's the guy that figured this whole thing out, predicated on everything I'm talking about. And then ultimately his firm got $800 million, and that's big. And that's pretty amazing, right? And then they have a movie that Brad Pitt plays in. Christian Bale plays Michael Burry, and Michael Burry is now, regarded as one of the best investors in history because he plays by the fundamentals, and he just sees things for what they are, right? And so he just took a big swing at it and bet the house on it, but that was nothing compared to a guy by the name of John Paulson. Not to be confused with Hank Paulson. John Paulson actually worked with Goldman Sachs to create shorts on the housing market, and that's what led up in the Supreme Court this summer, and they handpicked what was going in to be able to short. When you have a vertical and you own the mortgage lending operation and the underwriting to be able to put loans into the system that you then mark as AAA and you put into pensions, you know exactly when you're going to blow it up. And by the way, just so you know, money managers refer to investors, particularly in the States, that are teachers and other sorts of, regular workers, as dumb money. So if that's the theme of the whole thing. You know what you know, and if you don't know what I'm talking about, they'll fuck you. They'll destroy you. And I'm smiling because it's disgusting, and I think about it, and I don't know why I'm smiling. It's just more like a kind of a thing that, you can't even bring yourself to say it. But, if we're going to have an African-American Supreme Court justice, I hope she's not Clarence Thomas. And I hope that she recognizes that Donald Trump is not Addie Polk. And I hope somebody somewhere gets to her the con. And I hope somebody somewhere starts screaming the story of Addie Polk to the rest of the world, particularly, and I mean this particularly, let's start with the names that I've already talked about in this whole thing. So you've got, again, LeBron James, and I love LeBron James. He's an incredible story, but he grew up 400 feet from what I understand, maybe it was 800 feet, from Antioch Baptist Church, where Addie Polk spent 4 decades in servitude to the Lord, and she ended up having to commit suicide when they stole her house from her illegally, okay? That's first and foremost. That story should be on Oprah Winfrey's plate, but Oprah Winfrey, as you may recall, was a huge supporter of Barack Obama. And I can tell you also from personal experience that Oprah Winfrey is a champion of a fantastic filmmaker, Ava DuVernay, and Ava DuVernay's done some fantastic work like, the 13th Amendment, and everything that means in systemic prisons. And then she did When They See Us. It was a fantastic series about, I can't remember what the shorthand of it was, but for these African-American youth that got set up, and this brings it back to Trump, got set up in New York for a rape that they didn't commit, and Trump was trying to have them throw the book back in the 80s, and they were innocent the whole time, and they destroyed their lives. They had to go to prison, and then they ended up, everything was just part and parcel of this horrific scenario that I'm talking about, and of course Trump was there, so put it all together. But I want to just finish this point first. Oprah Winfrey and Ava DuVernay, initially our agent, when I was trying to get the story of Addie Polk out to the world, we had the same agent. And this story went to Ava DuVernay, and she passed. I'm not sure why. Maybe it had something to do with Oprah not wanting Barack Obama to be outed as a guy who protected Wall Street that destroyed African Americans in a monumental way. Not to mention, of course, white Americans that gave us MAGA. And to all you MAGAs out there that are going, oh, good, he got Obama, good, he got Holder, good, he's talking about Oprah. Yeah, good for him. No, it's not just those guys, my friends. Trump is all over this. And in the end, Trump made himself out to be, again, I've said it before, but I'll say it again. He sued Deutsche Bank for being, for him being a victim of predatory lending. This billionaire, Mr. King of New York, this guy who's stuck it to every worker that's ever worked for him, and he's taking money left and right because he's got these schemes and everything else, and he inherited $1 billion, and then he's going to make America great again, and you're going to fall for it? Not to mention he's, being an investigator right now for control fraud, which is all over the con, which this whole thing is. So, look, please, everybody, send Addie Polk in the spirit of Addie Polk to everybody I mentioned, okay? Especially Obama and especially Holder and Trump, quite frankly, because they're all in on it. And I'll finish up with what I finished, and I swear, if there's anything that could get inside these freaking hearings, it would be this right now. And I hope it shakes up Black America, because, BLM was certainly a justified scenario, given everything, this monstrosity that took place with the murder of, unarmed Black men under all of those different circumstances, not to mention all of the other, horrific scenarios that took place. But my God, this is the truth of the systemic racism that Dr. West and Reverend Barber talk about without the details. I'm Patrick Lovell, man. I'm just truth bombing the con, and I'm trying to bring you the details. Don't kill the messenger. Everybody needs to wake up to this madness, because the choices we have are corruption or corruption with a white supremacy bent. Are you kidding me? I'm trying to reconfigure life, liberty, and justice for all based on the integrity of the law, and liberty and justice for all with the dynamism and the spirit of upward mobility, because the system works, because it's honest. But it's not. It's corrupt to the gills, and everybody's in on it. Let's stop being played. Let's stop being suckers. I got tired of them pissing on my head, telling me it's rain, because they must have thought I was some kind of new fool. What about you? Onwards and upwards.